Welcome to the Organizational Transformation Kung Fu Podcast with your hosts, Sandy Verrecchia and Jennifer Long.
So welcome to our latest episode of Organizational Transformation Kung Fu. I'm Sandy Verrecchia, an HR specialist and executive coach from Toronto, Canada. And I'm super excited today to talk to somebody really special about their new book. And I think today's episode is exceptionally poignant because it really speaks to our analogy of Kung Fu as in terms of leadership, and is something that all good things that you want to change or take root need time and patience to get it right. And over the many episodes that we've done on this podcast, we've talked a lot about accountability. We've had many guest speakers, but today my guest speaker is exceptionally special. I'm humbled to be able to interview our very own Jen T. Long, OT Kung Fu podcast co-host, accountability guru, and now for the first time, we can add author to her many accomplishments. Welcome, Jen, and congratulations on your first book.
Woohoo! It's finally here. Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be a guest and a host on the podcast.
You have to go back and forth for sure.
So I
got the chance to read. So the book is in pre-order now. It's live on March 22nd. I got the chance to read it in advance. It's a great book. It's an easy read. We were just saying it's about a plain read, right? So, we always do things in terms of how long does it take me to get to New York? I could read a book in that time.
Right. Can I read this book on hold? Okay, then I'll buy it.
Yeah. So a really, really, really good book. So Jen's new book is called Own Up: How to Hold People Accountable Without All the Drama. So I know this book has been a labor of love for you. So why don't you tell us about your journey?
Yes, this has been a book in the making for 20 years, right? It's based on a training program that we've been delivering for clients for just as long, right? And so as we did more and more work and more clients in this program, we just were like, we really should write a book about that. Oh yeah, we should really write a book about that. And we sort of had that conversation for a decade or so until finally the pandemic was upon us. And what does one do when one gets off the road? One writes a book. And so it's been in the plan for quite a while, but I think we finally sort of felt like now's the time. And I had the time. And so that is really kind of the genesis of the book itself.
Excellent. So let's talk about the title. Why Own Up, and what do you mean about drama?
Why Own Up and why the drama? Okay, so Own Up is kind of that turn of phrase. When you talk about accountability and you define accountability for people, it's about taking ownership. And owning up is that power, right? When you own up to stuff, you own up to your mistakes, you own up to your oversights, you own up to where you chose to spend your time instead of doing your work, all that stuff that we need to do to take ownership. And so it's just kind of that shorthand and catchphrase for, when people need to own up to stuff, they take accountability. And so that's where we got the title. And the drama part is the fact that these conversations have forever been thought of as difficult, tough, fierce, crucial, all of the acronyms around this is really a hard conversation because of the drama that gets associated with it. The fact that, people respond, oh my God, they're going to get angry. There's going to be throwing of crockery. People will be upset. They'll hate me. Oh my God, this is such a hard thing to say. I feel terrible, right? All of the emotional content that comes with the experience that people have had in the past and how they think about it, that's the drama. And so what the hope is here and what the program's always been about is how do you actually engage in these conversations around ownership, around responsibility, around accountability, without all of the heightened negative emotion and all of the worry and anxiety and tension, aka drama.
Well, it's a great book. And so in it, I love the fact that you've used all these really fun cartoon, I guess, like illustrations to illustrate your point.
My
So it's,
pop art theme.
yeah, it's good. Is that what it's called? Okay.
Yeah,
Awesome. I
yeah,
like
that
it.
sort of Liechtenstein vibe because it was when in thinking about how to illustrate I didn't want to do like corporate-y kind of people because I was like, you know, and
Yeah.
it seemed to have more of a timeless effect. Plus, you could really, create the facial expressions
Yes, in
and
it
make
for
the
sure.
point.
And I love
Yeah,
it because you could have just put tables and charts like many of the books that we read. So this is a breath of fresh air for sure, for sure. So
thanks.
there is a phrase that you've used many times during our different podcasts and chatting with me or and chatting with our guests. And that's your conversations are your relationships. What do you mean by that?
In the sense of conversation being the relationship, it's really about the fact that how we talk to people, right? How we talk to each other, the frequency we talk to each other, the tone, the language, all of that is indicative of the relationship we're having, right? The fact that so to take that in the contrary form, when we're not talking to people, we're not having a relationship. And so the pain of when somebody cuts you off and says, I don't want to talk about that. We're not talking about that, that is distancing, that is shutting things down. And so the whole essence of how we have relationship is how we talk to each other and when we talk to each other and what we talk to each other about. That's the relationship, right?
Yes, yes. And I think there's something in there. I'm pretty sure I read it in there. It is that email is not a conversation. Email is not a relationship.
Correct. Correct. I mean, we can be sending information back and forth to each other, and we can be in a flow of sending information back and forth to each other. But the interesting thing about conversation is when we think about conversation, when we go back and we want to think about a conversation we had had or this thing that happened with this person, we don't necessarily remember the things that we've said to each other. We don't remember the messaging and the text and the things. What we remember is how we feel about it. And so that's why conversation dialogue is very much all of the things that are said, but it's also how the things
Mhm.
were said and all of the nonverbal that comes along in that interaction.
Right, right. Excellent. So one of the things throughout your book is you draw on your work in the theater. So I was curious if you want to maybe tell our listeners a little bit about, why you're drawing on that as an analogy and what you've learned from the theater that helped you kind of frame some of the book up.
Right? The theater forever. When I was in college and I was getting my degree in theater, people would say, "Oh, what are you going to do when you get out of college?" It was always like, "Oh, wait tables," because that's what you do when you get a theater degree. But what I've really found is what I took from that is very applicable relative to the work I do from a coaching and training perspective. And the disciplines that you get in theater, because my whole love was the directing role. So it wasn't about being on stage, it was really about putting the show together. And the study you do in a script, right, of understanding dialogue, and the dialogue are the relationships, and really parsing a script and understanding how you create the score based on the language of what the action is on stage. So that work really helps me understand uh, communication and conversation at a different level. And so that's been a really interesting piece to bring along in understanding how conversation works and dialogue works and communication skills. The other piece is the big one is role play, because role play is an improv, right? So there's the improvisational aspect of role play is really the combination, and being able to take clients and work with them in a safe environment and a fun environment, because accountability has a lot of associations to the anxiety and the nervousness of, it's really the vulnerability of putting yourself out there and having to hold someone accountable. But being able to do that in a role play environment, being able to do that at an improv level so that people get a sense of and build muscle memory around what that feels like, what the language can do, why you want to pay attention to the language, because the words you choose change the tenor of the conversation and that whole experience. And so those skills and those practices help people to feel stronger in the moment, because what it does is it builds muscle around standing in. And improv is always that yes and, right? Yes and so it takes away the resistance that we always get into of what happens if this, oh my god. And it's like, no, just take it, just take what you get. Yes and let's move through the next thing. And so those were kind of the improv, the role play, the dialogue, all of those together have what given me kind of a little bit of an edge on how to understand this skill set.
Right, because you do bring in a lot of the notion of the brain into your book and how it impacts those conversations, and drawing and letting people understand what's happening in your brain when you're in that fight or flight mode, or when you're having to hold somebody accountable for something, right?
Yes. Yeah. The conversational intelligence, which isn't my body of work. That is work that was done by a gal named Judith Glazier. And she wrote a book called Conversational Intelligence, and I went through a certification program with her. And her work is fascinating because I do a lot of coaching with engineers and those people, that sort of black and white rational thinker. Understanding the science of what actually is happening in your brain relative to how we connect and connecting through conversation really gives you better insight as to why soft skills work, why these kinds of communication skills have the impacts they have. And so I thought that was an important piece of the book, because it's such great understanding to bolster the commitment to practice it, because you really start to understand the connection of language and the physiology and where your brain goes, and how your brain works, and how the person you're talking to, what their brain's doing, and how that impacts how they show up and react and respond, and how you can influence that.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting because you talk in your, I think, step number 4, and we'll get into your process in a minute, but is to prepare and rehearse, and that is that, you know, understanding what could happen, and kind of stepping into it, and being prepared, right, rather than just having that conversation on the fly.
Right. And you and I both know, as executive coaches, the longer you've been in that executive role, that leader role, the more off the cuff you like to be, the more you tend to just roll, right? You get into that, what you call unconscious competence, right? You don't know what you know. And so you just can talk about things much easier. The interesting part of this is this practice of accountability is something that needs to come with intention, right? And when you are a good communicator, and it doesn't matter how long you've been in your seat, the more you understand when you come to the conversation with intention, thinking about that intention, really thinking through language. What is the best word for me to use in this situation? What specifically are the things I need to put on the table? And how do I want to talk about that in a way that makes the most sense and can get to the point quickly? Because I think accountability conversations always suffer the talking around things, intimating things, bringing in all this history, which increases the drama, so to speak. And so part of the skill is taking that, being more direct, making it easier, and not speaking off the cuff, right?
Right. You're right. The more stuff you add into the conversation, the more anxiety the other person, and then so they're just sitting there waiting with well, I'm just going to respond when I have the chance, right? And they're going to blurt out their response. So absolutely. So you're right. Intention is really important. So in your book, you kind of break it down into mind shift, skill shift, time shift. Why did you use those buckets?
Because I think when you move into the role of manager and leader, and when you are in the people business, and you are now sort of having to get things done through others, that it takes those kinds of shifts in how you think about it. And so when I'm really focused in on this topic in particular, the shift around the mindset shift, right? So the value shift, how you approach it, what your experience has been. So mind shift has or mindset really has a lot to do with what your experience has been, right? How you've seen it in the past, how you've done it in the past, all of that kind of stuff, how you see what's important. So many times conversations are always about the results. And it's, it's the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. We always talk about, we didn't get the report on time, or this was a huge disappointment. We just need to, we need to go back to the drawing board and do this again, right? And they're always focused on the results as opposed to standing out of that and really thinking about the person, right? The person was making decisions. The person was responsible for this thing. And so what was the person doing, and how does the person's choices and their behaviors actually impact, instead of talking about just the results, to really kind of pull it back and go, let's talk about what's going on with you. And so that's why the shift in the mindset is really that relationship versus result, and thinking about that approach, but also thinking about what is the baggage you're bringing to the party relative to how you've been thinking about it in the past, and trying to get people to understand that accountability is not punitive. Accountability is not about getting people in trouble and putting the hammer down. Accountability is really only an act of clarity.
Right.
And when you start to really think about it in those terms, that shift itself is helpful. That's the first part. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And you say in there, and I was going to ask you, because it sounds so simple, right? You say accountability is an act of clarity. Its only outcome is clarity around ownership of either actions or inactions, and of the choices associated with those actions or inactions. So it sounds so simple, but you and I know it is not. It is hard for a couple of reasons that you've just mentioned. But when you distill it down to something as simple as that, how do you shift? How do you shift the mindset around that with people?
Well, it's talking them through it, right? In getting them to own. So that's why in the program, when we start to really think about, what is your issue, what's going on for you, and getting people to really understand what's going on for them, and that when we get the skills going and how you practice it, what you start to realize is it's not this crazy punitive 45-minute meeting. It's a 5-minute conversation. It's a 10-minute conversation, right? Because you don't have to, because it's about clarity and getting ownership. Most of the conversation is really about what do we want to do going forward. It's not about how do I get the ownership in the moment. And I think that for people, once they start to understand and get to the practice part, starts to be the mind shift around, oh, this isn't such a heavy load. This isn't such a hard ask as we've thought.
Mm-hmm.
But it does require us to be a little bit vulnerable.
Yes, vulnerability is the key. And bouncing forward, not back. I think that's another kind of aspect, right? It's about how are you going to go forward? But as we've talked many times, accountability is often punitive, or seen as punitive. And so that's why the conversations are long.
Yeah. And a lot of people spend an inordinate amount of time like getting the history of things. Like, I got to bring my facts and my proof because I have to prove to you what you're screwing up.
Yes, that's right.
That's not it at all. That's not it at all. And that, I think, helps when you start to, that's this mindset shift too, is you don't need all that.
Right. But you do have to have consequences.
Yes. Consequences are what we refer to as the ugly twin, but you don't have accountability if you don't have consequences. And consequences are not punishment. Consequences is just a corollary effect of not taking ownership and it should be in direct proportion to whatever the issue is. And so there's a whole chapter on really thinking through, how do you think about consequences? What are they really? And how do you make it proportional? Because I think what gives accountability a bad rap is when people get consequences that are disproportionate to the things that have gone on, where people get fired
Right.
for things or written up on things, or that is that really the consequence you want?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And performance improvement plans are a lot of work, when really, if you're better at accountability, you should not have to get to the performance improvement plan.
Right. Right. For sure. So let's talk about your program.
Yes. Let's talk about that.
You've got 6 steps within it. It's accountability SOS.
The accountability SOS model. Yeah. So what I did in the book is, and this wasn't necessarily in the program when I did it, when we've been doing it, this was a result of actually writing the book, is distilled it into this 6 steps. And the program deals with all of the skills you need to be effective in these 6 steps. But the practice of holding someone accountable is just a 6-step process. And it's notable to say that the first 4 steps are all things you do on your own before you ever open your mouth, which is why you never talk off the cup when you hold people accountable, because you need to do a little reflective work, and you need to do a little thinking about what's going on, what's happening, what are the impacts, right? So the first step is what's your issue, right? And people are surprised when we practice on this one how they bring these generalizations into the conversation, right? And I give some examples in the book, and it's things like when people think, oh, this person's got a time management problem, they can't get their stuff done on time. And when you really get down to it, is it time management, or is there something else in particular? What is it about their time that's a problem? And how they're doing things, that's a problem. And so when you really start to peel back the onion on some things, what you start to realize is, I think there's an example in the book about a 24-hour customer service turnaround call, right? And that's the issue, not necessarily the person's time management, because those are blanket terms for big skill sets. And so if you're going to hold somebody accountable, holding them accountable for their time management is just too vague, versus what's really the issue. Oh, they don't return calls in 24 hours. Well, that's a much easier conversation and a much shorter conversation. And so really getting to the core, step 1, what's your issue? The second step is thinking through, where did this person make a poor choice, right? Understanding when they knew the report was going to be late, what did they choose to do? And really getting into what that might be. And so there's a whole model in the book about how you analyze performance and how you think about it, because the choice point is how you approach the conversation. So it's really good to understand what that is, so that you're coming in at the right perspective. And then once you figure out where your choice point is and how you want to approach it, then you're going into what the impacts are, right? So you're clear in your own mind that here's what's going on as a result of you not doing this well, right? So I'm going to hold you accountable because there's impacts. I need to be clear on what those are so I can connect the dots. That creates leverage. That creates impetus around ownership, because it's not because nothing's happening. It's like, you got to deal with this because there's stuff going, you're having an impact. I need to know what those are. Then it's the practice, right? Practice and rehearse it. And this is the interesting step that everybody wants to skip, because you can look at this diagram and go, yeah, oh, okay, well, let me give this a try. But our brain is really good at shorthand. And so when we're thinking about a conversation and we're thinking about, okay, I'm just going to say this, that whole experience is very, very different than how do you say something out loud. In class, when we do this in real time, I'll get people up at the front of the room and they'll start a conversation, and everybody in the back room's like, oh no, they can hear what's happening, right? And it's like, because they're just like, oh, you need to do this, and then I'll say, okay, you come up and do it, and then they get in the hot seat, and then they blow it, because in your head it always sounds like, oh, I'm such a genius, I can just say this. But when you actually get across from somebody and you get real-time feedback and eyeballs and you're in the moment, your brain's going to do some other stuff. And so that rehearsal is what gives you the clarity and competence and muscle memory to stand in that moment when you actually have to do it. And so that's a huge step.
Yeah. And so that's step 4. So that's what you do by yourself before you even get to the person. But I want to circle back into these choice points, because you've talked about them throughout the book, right? And so how do you know, you're at the right choice point? I think you say something about choice point location determines time and effort. So, and it shifts. So what does that actually mean?
Yes. So the performance drivers and choice points model is a model that helps visualize and understand what goes into performance on a daily basis. Like whenever you're performing, you're making decisions, and you're making decisions around behavior, you're making decisions around your skill set, you're making decisions around your attitude, and you're making decisions around your beliefs and values. And so it all starts at the back with your beliefs and values and then moves forward. And there's a sort of this line of difference of, I'm going to approach a conversation where I've got choice points around, do they have skills? Do they have the skills or not have the skills? Can they engage the behaviors or not engage the behaviors? Or have they got self-destructive behaviors, right? Those are choice points. And those are kind of coaching conversations around, let's modify behavior. Let's talk about skill development. Versus if I've got people making choice points more around mindsets and attitudes, or around beliefs and values, which means I think that this other thing is important. And even though the company says this is important, or the manager says this is important, I disagree. I think this is important. So I'm making choices there. That's a different conversation, because those are more of a counseling approach versus a coaching approach. And so that we go into some detail in the book on what that really means and why that's important. Because the further back, so the closer to choice points around mindsets and beliefs and values, the more time and effort you're going to have to spend with someone to get them to engage at the performance result you're looking for.
Right.
Because when it, and I would never say to managers that, your job is to change people's, beliefs, because that's not going to happen. Right. But it's really clarifying to understand, oh, I'm dealing with someone who's conflicted about what they're holding to be important versus what I'm holding to be important. And so the conversation isn't necessarily about the result at all. It's about, I've sensed we've got a conflict. And let's have a conversation about being accountable on that front versus, right, you just don't have the skill and you need to get trained up. It's a different, and I know it's going to take longer, and I know it's going to be more investment. And that's where it's good to understand where those sit, because the longer people sit in those decisions, the more performance problems you have for a longer period of time.
Right. And so that whole notion of performance drivers and choice points, which is a trademarked program that you have, is important throughout the conversation. Yeah, it's a model. Yeah, for sure. Okay. So 6 steps. We've identified the issue, which again, I think is brilliant, because it's, again, simple, but brilliant, because if you don't spend time and you just kind of, the first thing that comes to your mind is what you see, is not always the case in that, right? Your choice points, your impact, and prepare and rehearse. And you say your book a couple of times through there, that people like to skip that one. So just like you're going for an interview, you would not go in without preparing. And I always tell people, when you're driving, interview yourself. What questions are they going to ask you? It's very similar, right? Because then you really frame in your mind what words are going to come out of your mouth. And it really kind of, it changes it. So, and then we've got step 5.
Step 5 is when you actually open your mouth.
Step 5. That's the scary part, though.
Right? That's when it's like, oh, showtime. So step 5 is engage the conversation. And that is right when you get on the phone or in front of someone, it's not an email, it's
Mm.
the dialogue you're going to have. And so because you've done all the prep work, when you actually open your mouth, you might be surprised at how fast an accountability conversation can actually happen. And so it's not just about what you're going to say, but it's also how prepared you are to listen. So because we've reduced your anxiety, we've reduced your tension, we've run you through the possible responses you might be getting, you're prepared. And so because you're a little more prepared and you're ready, you can also hear better. And
Mm.
listening is half of the conversation because the whole point is if you're holding them accountable, you got to be able to hear, are they taking ownership or are they not?
Right.
And how you respond to that is just as important as getting the information out. Did they own it? Did they not own it? What did you hear? Most of the time,
Mhm.
you don't get ownership. You get excuses. You get a bunch of things that went, the shaming, the blaming, the pointing of fingers, all of the things that people do where they're like, yeah, well, or you get yes, but, right? Yeah, I own that, but. And yes, but is not
Yes.
really ownership. It's yes, but. And
Mhm.
so understanding how you hear what you hear and then how do you respond to what you hear. That all happens in your step 5.
Right. And you can't listen if you're trying to think about what you're going to say. And that's why
Right.
that rehearse step is so incredibly important, right? Kind of goes back to that. And so that you can give the space in your mind and the mental fortitude to actually spend and listen and understand what they're saying.
Yeah. And that's kind of a big aha for people because they're not really gauged on, and then they say they don't own it. And then what? Right. And
Yes.
that's
Yes.
the then what is in there.
Yeah. So before we go on to the last step, what happens in this conversation when you're listening and you've prepared, you're ready, you're had your conversation, you said your piece, you're listening, and the person is in victim mode. So it's the yeah but or no but, and then they just won't take accountability for what you're talking about. Any tips on what someone might do in that situation?
Oh, yes. There's a whole understanding of a learning around what denial sounds like and what do you do? Because most of the time, when someone says no or yes, but managers love to problem solve. And so what they hear is what the problems are. And they want to go and they want to solve the problems that people are listing off, right? In the but part of the whole comment. And that's not the most effective response because that is why it feels like we have the same conversations over and over again, or why no one takes responsibility, because then it turns into this whole thing about we have this problem with this other team and then we got it's about the other team and it feels over, oh, it's all too hard. When really, when people are, what's really happening is when they say things like that, what they're essentially doing is not taking ownership.
Right. And they're putting it back on you, right? As the manager,
Well,
you're
they're
you're really
derailing
taking it
it. They're
on.
sending it to other people. They go into
Yeah.
victim, all that stuff. And so, what you got
Yeah.
to hear is you got to understand what you're hearing, and what you're hearing is not ownership. And so, you got to be clear on what you're hearing. And so, the tip is you've got to confront the denial, and that's a whole skill in and of itself. And I go into detail in the book on what that sounds like, what that looks like, and how you do it. And
Yes.
that's the key because that's what turns the conversation.
Hmm. Yeah. So, all the readers or listener of our podcast who pick up your book on March 22nd or pre-order now, need to spend some time there because I think that's one of those crucial moments in this conversation that it could go either way. And as much as you want it to go the right way, if they are in that and you're not naming it and you're not talking about it, you'll walk away with another
You walk away
conversation.
feeling very unsatisfied. Exactly.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Exactly. And there's a big theme in the book about naming things and putting words on things and making very clear what it is, because once you name it, they can own it. And if they can own it, they can change it.
That's right.
And that's why it's important.
Yes. Awesome. All right. We have our last build solutions.
Build solutions. So once you got ownership, right, step 6 is, what do you do with that, right? Because ownership isn't just about owning the results. I have to own the results. I have to own the impact of those results. I've got to own what I want to do about changing, right? So if I'm going to take ownership, I got to own my solutions. And so if accountability isn't just saying, yeah, I messed up, it's, yeah, I messed up and I understand what that means. And so based on that, I own what I'm going to do next. That's what accountability is. It's the full suite of all those pieces of ownership. And so building solutions is, how do you get effective at what you're trying to do to move the ball forward, right? And the solutions are really based on where they've taken ownership, which goes back to your choice points, right? Do I have a skill deficit? Do I need to get training? Do I have a destructive behavior that I need to modify? What is that going to look like, and how am I going to engage in that? Do I have an attitude problem? How am I going to address that, right? And do I have a conflict? And what do I want to do with that conflict? So it's helping managers, and that's the simplicity part, right? Is being able to help people build solutions, and can the manager help coach and develop the things they need to coach and develop, and can they counsel the things they need to counsel, so that if people take ownership and they are willing, there is a way forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. I think it's a really powerful book. I like how you've laid it out. I like the learning that you had, that your program wasn't necessarily lined up with that, but for a book, it actually is really well laid out, because as a manager, you can just go through the steps and to kind of tick them off and say, okay, I'm going to do it this way. So that's really good.
Right.
So in the wrap up of your book, you start talking about, which I found is a bit interesting, that you didn't start with this, you ended with this, the difference between managing and coaching. And so you've given them all this information about accountability, and then you start talking about the whole notion of managing versus coaching.
Right. Where managing is managing is very much about results. Managing is setting expectations, right? And we talk about expectations, that accountability problems are always usually about some kind of unmet expectation. And so how good are, and understanding that the management role is setting the clear expectation. If you get good at that, your ability to hold people accountable to those expectations gets a lot easier. And that's really the management part of it in the how I talk about it. When manager turns into coach is when it becomes about development. It becomes about change. It becomes about improvement. And that's the coaching part of it, because coaching isn't feedback. Coaching isn't like, I got to go coach this guy, which means I'm giving him information about stuff he's not doing well. No, if I'm going to coach a guy, it's all about, how am I supporting this person in developing something specific, becoming better at something. And the management thing is all very clear. And here's what you need to do. Here's how well you're doing it. Here's where we're having a problem. Coaching is, let's work on this. How do I support this? Let's practice it, right? It's safe to fail when you're in a coaching environment versus when you're in a delivery environment. And so really kind of trying to seed that notion, because I think for a long time, and depending on what company you work for and the semantics they love, the coaching feedback thing gets very convoluted, and feedback is a management skill, and it's different in coaching.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very good. So, Jen, you've kind of walked us through your book. There's so many great things in there. I had so many little quotes that I'm going to take away into my daily life for sure. It's beginning of March now. In a couple of weeks, you get this book that's going to hit the Amazon shelves, I guess. Where else can people pick up this book?
You can pre-order it right now through Amazon. It'll be available. They'll ship it March 22nd. It's going to be at Barnes & Noble, I believe, as well. and it will also be in audiobook. I've done all the recording of the audiobook, so that will be released probably shortly after the print version is released. And yeah, super exciting.
It is exciting. It is exciting. So I was thrilled to read it. I think it's a great book. Everybody should pick it up. Any last words of wisdom before I let you go at our 40 minutes of our podcast for our about
Try to
accountability?
keep it short and sweet. If you want more information, you can go to we got a website. You can go to jennifertlong.com. Much more information there about, there's an assessment you can take on accountability. There's one also on my Management Possible website. If you go to the Own Up program, where you can just find out more about the program, and there's a different assessment there that you can take to kind of get an idea about where you stand on some of the things and how we frame it.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, good luck with the launch of your book, Jen. And I look forward to sharing it with all of my customers, that's for sure, and clients. And I know that you're going to be spending some time with some of my clients in the next little while too. So that's awesome. So thanks very much for writing this really important book.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for doing the whole interview and inviting me as a guest on my own podcast. Yay!
Awesome.
All right.
Thanks, Jen.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening, and please visit Sandy's website at satoriconsultinginc.ca. That's SATORI consultinginc.ca, and Jen's website at managementpossible.com. Thanks again.